In the interior of Scotland, in an isolated region where the mist persists until mid-afternoon, there is a village forgotten by time called Dunloch. Few outside of it know its name, and even fewer know about the horrors that have unfolded there over the centuries. It's in Dunloch that our first story begins. A story that mixes the whispering of cold winds and the muffled sound of footsteps that should never have crossed that land. James McAlister, a researcher of local antiquities, moved to Dunloch seeking ancient documents for his thesis. He was a meticulous man, accustomed to living among books and manuscripts, far from the city lights. However, the solitude he found, there was not what he expected. The heavy air and the oppressive silence of the village seemed to whisper dark secrets to him, especially when night fell and the few residents retreated to their homes, locking doors and windows. In the second week of his stay, James discovered a dusty diary in an old attic, written by a former resident named Angus MacFarlane, a blacksmith who lived in the 19th century. The diary recounted a series of disturbing events, unexplained disappearances, screams echoing through the nearby forest, and, most terrifyingly, a dark creature that hunted at night. According to Angus, this entity was not human and didn't seem to belong to any known local legend. James, skeptical, continued his research until one particularly cold night. He heard footsteps in the corridor of his room. When he opened the door, there was nothing but oppressive silence. But the strangest thing was the smell of burned iron that permeated the air. The next morning, he found deep scratches on the wooden door, as if sharp claws had tried to break through. Apprehension increased when James discovered that several former residents of the village had disappeared without a trace during the 19th century, coinciding with Angus's account, especially the McGregor family, who vanished entirely one winter night without explanation, leaving behind only the flames of the burned house and an aura of mystery that still hasn't been unraveled. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, James decided to follow in Angus's footsteps, exploring the forest and the locations mentioned in the diary. There, he found strange symbols carved into trees, marks that resembled claws, and almost illegible inscriptions that seemed to plead for help or perhaps curse anyone who dared to venture there. It was during one of these nighttime excursions that he saw something he would never forget. A hooded figure with eyes shining like embers, standing at the edge of the forest. Before he could react, the creature disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a silence heavier than the night itself. James knew he was no longer dealing with superstitions, but with something real and deadly. Fear didn't let him rest in the following nights. Gradually, he realized that the creature seemed to be pursuing him, appearing in places where it shouldn't be. One of those times, he almost lost his life by stumbling into an ancient trap made to catch animals, but which seemed destined for something much larger. With his heart racing and his skin crawling, James understood that he was at the center of a bloody plot, where the past and present mingled in a macabre dance. Unable to avoid it, he decided to return to the village to confront the few remaining inhabitants. But upon arrival, he found the streets deserted, the houses locked, and a growing feeling that the evil still lived there, feeding on the fear of those who dared to stay. On his last night in Dunloch, James felt the chill of death hovering around his window, like invisible fingers trying to pull him out. The next morning, he was found by the inhabitants of the neighboring village, disoriented, with deep marks on his back, and a gaze that reflected the madness of someone who had seen the impossible. James never spoke about Dunloch again, but his diary, found among his belongings, contained horrifying accounts that still defy any rational explanation. This was just the first of the accounts that would turn Dunloch into a living legend of horror and mystery. Next, we'll travel to a village in Siberia, where the eternal winter hides secrets as dark as the cold that freezes the souls of those who live there. In the frozen heart of Siberia, where winter seems to never end and the wind carries more than just snow, lies the village of Verkhnaya Zima. Few survive its long and cruel nights, and even fewer escape unscathed from what hides beneath its frozen surface. This is the land where our second story begins, an account that defies sanity and reveals the price of meddling with forces beyond human control. Dmitry Volkov, a retired geologist who had spent most of his life studying the glaciers and ice caves of the region, moved to Verkhnaya Zima, seeking tranquility and seclusion after an accident that left him forever marked. His past in mining rare crystals made him a respected but solitary figure, isolated even among his neighbors. One night, while exploring a nearby cave, Dmitri discovered a hidden chamber where ice and stone met in a way never seen before. In the center of the chamber, a strange artifact, carved from a black and shiny material, was stuck in the frozen ground. Upon touching the object, a wave of despair and terror invaded his mind, making him recoil abruptly. From that moment on, Dmitri began to have vivid nightmares where voices whispered his name in forgotten languages and shadows moved without form within the darkness of his room. The nights became more difficult, and his physical and mental health began to deteriorate rapidly. He felt with each dawn that something within him had changed, something hungry, something that yearned for more than just his mind. In the village, inexplicable events began to occur. Animals disappeared mysteriously, deep marks appeared in the snow, and residents reported hearing a heart-wrenching cry coming from the mountains, a sound that seemed to freeze even the warmest heart. Dmitri, consumed by the obsession to understand the artifact, drifted further and further from reality, until one night he vanished without a trace, disappearing into the icy darkness. Days later, local hunters found his belongings scattered at the edge of the frozen forest, along with a circle of ancient symbols made with frozen blood, and tracks that seemed to be from enormous claws, much larger than any known animal. The last clue was a murmur that echoed through the wind, a voice that said, "He's gone to where the light doesn't reach." Dmitri's story became a warning to the few who dare to venture into that region, a warning that gets lost among the legends and the cutting silence of the ice. But the terror of Siberia doesn't end there. In the same village, another tragedy marked the memory of those who remained: the curse of the Zharov family. Anatoly Zharov, a former military man known for his strength and discipline, inherited the old family mansion after the mysterious death of his father. From the first day, the place seemed to breathe a negative energy, walls that creaked on their own, shadows that moved in the corners of his vision, and an inexplicable cold that penetrated to the bones. Anatoly tried to resist, believing it was just ghosts of the past, but soon realized that the evil there was much more tangible. One night, Anatoly found an ancient grimoire in the attic, hidden behind loose boards. The book spoke of ancient rituals to control spirits, but also warned of a high price: the lives of those who dared to invoke forces they didn't understand. Ignoring the warnings, Anatoly tried to use the grimoire to protect himself from what he felt was lurking around his house, but ended up unleashing something much worse. What happened that night is told by the few neighbors who heard the piercing screams coming from the mansion. When the police finally arrived, they found the house empty, but with bloodstains scattered across the floor and walls, symbols carved with nails on doors and furniture, and a silence heavier than the darkness itself. Anatoly had disappeared, along with several animals that lived in the surrounding area, leaving behind only a trail of fear and madness. Residents believe that the house is still alive, possessed by an entity that feeds on pain and despair, and that anyone who gets too close may never return. And so, between ice, blood, and madness, the second story ends. A cruel reminder that some secrets should remain buried under the eternal ice. Before moving on to the next story, I wanted to invite you to be part of this community of mysteries and terrors. If you're enjoying these stories, how about leaving a word or phrase in the comments that represents fear to you? It can be anything, from a sound that gives you chills to an object that scares you. I want to see what this fearful community has to say. And of course, if you're not subscribed yet, here's the silent invitation to join our group. No need to make a promise, just a small step to continue exploring this frightening universe with me. Now, if you're ready, let's move on to the next destination. A dark village on a remote island in Indonesia, where darkness seems to have a face and a voice of its own. On the island of Sumbawa, a little explored place in Indonesia, surrounded by dense jungles and treacherous seas, there is a village called Labuan Hitam, known for its dark legends and forgotten rituals. Few dare to arrive there, especially after sunset, when whispers take over the trees and the air becomes thick as if it carries an invisible presence. At 38 years old, Raden Pratama, a local folklore researcher, was sent by a university to record the customs of that isolated community. Raden was skeptical by nature, a man of science who didn't believe in superstition. But he knew that to understand certain cultures, he had to approach them, even if it meant entering the unknown. On the first day, the reception was cold. Residents avoided his gaze, murmuring among themselves in ancient dialects, and the children ran to hide when he passed by. Raden felt a weight in his chest that he couldn't explain, a growing feeling of being watched, even in open places. During a moonless night, Raden was invited to witness a sacred ritual in the forest. A ceremony that, according to the elders, protected the village from an ancestral evil called Makhluk Gelap, the creature of darkness. What began as a celebration, with songs and dances, quickly turned into a macabre scene when the residents began to invoke ancient spirits with chants that seemed to cross time. Raden watched, fascinated, until he realized that something was wrong. Among the participants, a hooded figure who didn't belong there moved in silence, avoiding gazes and touching symbols drawn on the ground. Gradually, the atmosphere became too heavy to ignore, and a thick fog emerged from the ground, enveloping everyone in a frozen mantle. The next morning, the village awoke to horror. Several people were missing, including children and the elderly. Panic took over, but no one dared to speak of what they saw the night before. Raden tried to find answers, but the elders just shook their heads in silence, as if uttering that name, Makhluk Gelap, would bring an even greater calamity. Determined to unravel the mystery, Raden entered the forest alone, following the tracks left by the fog. What he found was something that no camera or notation could record without distorting his sanity. An altar made of human bones, surrounded by symbols that seemed to pulse in an unknown language. In the center, a black shiny object, similar to a gem, emitted a cold and hypnotic light. Upon touching the stone, Raden felt a piercing pain in his chest, as if something inside him was trying to get out. He heard whispers, promises, and threats, and a voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You awakened what slept. Now you're part of the cycle." When he returned to the village, he was no longer the same. His eyes carried an empty glow, and his words became enigmatic, as if he spoke a language that no one else understood. That night, a fire consumed the village, and Raden disappeared without leaving tracks. Years later, local fishermen still report seeing a pale figure wandering among the ruins of Labuan Hitam, with eyes that reflect an abyssal emptiness, as if carrying the darkness of a secret that no human should know. This story reminds us that there are forces that man was not made to control, and that knowledge can be a curse as heavy as fear. In the heart of southern Spain, in the mountainous region of Andalusia, there is a village called Valverde de la Sombra, a name that already suggests its sinister reputation. They say that the village was built on ancient Roman catacombs, where bloody rituals were practiced centuries ago, and evil took root in the soil, like a weed that never dies. Katerina, a 27-year-old investigative journalist, arrived in that village intending to write an article about the occult traditions of the region. Unlike the residents, Katerina was fearless and always believed that horror stories were exaggerations to keep the curious away. But what she found there would be able to change her perspective forever. On the first night, while exploring the Roman ruins, Katerina found an ancient diary hidden inside a false wall. The pages, yellowed and full of dried bloodstains, belonged to a priest from antiquity who described bizarre rituals and human sacrifices offered to appease the spirits of shadow. The reading left Katerina disturbed, but it was the first spark that ignited a fire within her. In the following days, strange phenomena began to occur. She heard footsteps echoing through the corridors of the boarding house where she was staying, voices whispering her name in dead languages, and saw shadows twisting on the walls as if they were alive. Determined, Katerina followed the descriptions in the diary to an underground crypt. Down there, among broken bones and ancient inscriptions, she found a kind of profane altar stained with recent blood. A lit candle flickered as if someone was waiting for her. Fear began to tighten her chest, but her curiosity was greater. Suddenly, a hooded figure appeared, blocking the exit. With a hoarse voice, it spoke that the sacrifice needed to continue to keep the village protected from the darkness that slept beneath the earth. Katerina tried to flee but felt paralyzed, as if the walls themselves had come to life to trap her. She woke up hours later, alone, with a strange mark on her arm, a symbol that she recognized from the diary, that seemed to burn as if it had been engraved on her skin. She tried to alert the residents, but they ignored her, or worse, looked at her with silent fear. That night, the entire village was awakened by screams that tore through the silence. Those who approached the old church saw black flames rising to the sky, and inside it, bodies of people who had disappeared months ago, mutilated in a grotesque manner, with the same symbols from the diary marked on their skin. Katerina disappeared that morning, and her diary was never found. Those who visit Valverde de la Sombra today speak of a presence that doesn't let anyone leave when the veil between the world of the living and the dead thins, and that feeds on fear to survive. Now, before continuing to the last block, I wanted to ask you something. If you're enjoying these accounts, how about leaving your like and subscribing to the channel? And since we're in a dark mood, tell me in the comments, what would be your ritual to protect yourself from something you can't even see, but know is there? It doesn't have to be something common. It can be even an invented amulet, a secret word, or even a quirk that you think wards off evil. I want to know your way of dealing with the unknown in a unique way, without that old talk of like and share, you know. This helps the channel a lot and also creates a community where we share not just fear, but also strategies to survive it. On the desolate coast of Maine, United States, there is a lighthouse known as the Eye of the Abyss. For decades, this lighthouse guided ships navigating the treacherous waters, but its reputation is tainted by inexplicable disappearances and a presence that many swear to feel, an ancient evil that doesn't let itself be illuminated. In 1984, a man named Elias, 39 years old, was hired to take care of the lighthouse during the harsh winter. A former soldier, Elias was a solitary and rigid man, accustomed to isolation and silence, but he never imagined he would face something that would challenge even his trained mind. In the first weeks, everything seemed normal, until a violent storm cut off the communication cable. Elias was completely isolated, with waves battering fiercely against the rocks and a thick fog enveloping everything around. That's when the first whispers began. He would wake up in the middle of the night feeling a presence, a cold that penetrated his bones, and see shadows moving at the edge of his vision. He tried to ignore it, attributing everything to loneliness and fear, but things got worse. One dawn, while checking the lighthouse light, Elias saw a figure in the fog, tall, with shining eyes and a smile that didn't seem human. The creature called him by name, whispering promises of power and vengeance, things that Elias would never have imagined desiring. He tried to flee, but the fog seemed alive, grabbing his feet, trapping him like a web. The lighthouse, his refuge, became a prison where darkness gained form and will of its own. Elias began to write a diary, recording his experiences, his fears, and the things the entity asked him to do. Macabre rituals, sacrifices of small sea creatures, until he himself felt consumed by a growing madness. In the last entry, Elias speaks of a cruel decision, a human sacrifice that should ensure that the lighthouse never went out, that the fog never dissipated, and that the Eye of the Abyss remained open for what lives beneath the waters. When the rescue team arrived months later, they found the lighthouse empty. No sign of Elias, just his notes scattered across the floor, and on the mirror of his room a message written with what seemed like dried blood. Never look at the fog, it sees you. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for accompanying these intense and frightening accounts. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to not miss the next stories that will explore even more the unknown and the terrifying, and more. Tell us in the comments which of these stories shook you the most, if you've experienced something similar, or what you learned differently from hearing these experiences. Let's create a community where fear becomes strength. Together, facing what's dark, but also sharing courage. I hope you felt that chill down your spine, and that these stories will stay on your mind for a good while. Until next time, and remember, the true horror is where you least expect it, and sometimes, just by telling it, we already start to face it.